Well, thank you, Danny, for that welcome and for your remarks. My name is Isabel Munilla. I'm policy lead on extractive industries transparency at Oxfam America. I'm so pleased to be with you today. This is a great, exciting event. It's a room full of people, a lot of friendly faces that have been in the fight with us for a lot of years. So really happy to have you all here. So thanks so much to Brookings for organizing this and hosting us. And on behalf of Oxfam and Publish What You Pay, thank you. Just a bit of background quickly on Oxfam. Our Global Extractive Industries program works in about 30 countries and has been working for over 15 years on oil, gas, and mining issues. Our focus is to protect and expand community rights to know and to decide, and to ensure those rights are equally enjoyed and shared by women and men. And by this we mean the right to know the true costs and the potential benefits of extraction, and the right to meaningfully participate and influence decisions about whether oil, gas, and mining projects move forward, and if they do, under what conditions. Over the past 15 years, we work with our allies in the Global Publish What You Pay Coalition. I serve on its Global Council as well as on the steering committee of Publish What You Pay United States. And worked for a long time with our friend Mariatti here, who I'll introduce in just a moment. And working with Publish What You Pay is a central plank in our right to know strategy to push the boundaries of transparency by changing global, national, and project level norms, as well as corporate norms. And thanks to this multi-jurisdictional coalition approach, as Danny said, we've had some success. Ideas that were considered radical, like contract disclosure, like project payment disclosure, are now considered international norms by the IMF. We have more information now than we've ever had, and the urgency to put that information to work has never been greater, as Danny pointed out. And as we face a climate crisis, the protection of a community's and the broader public's right to know and to decide their own fate has never been more important. So I'm very pleased to be hosting this fantastic panel to take stock of where we are and what we've learned to inform the years ahead. And thanks to the support, as Danny said, of the Open Society Foundation, we've spent the past couple of days together discussing and unpacking these lessons learned. So our ideas are coming in fresh to this panel. And then there's many other folks in the room who also participated and can share the ideas that we've learned. So let me introduce you to our panel. Immediately to my left, I have Don Hubert, President of Resources for Development Consulting. I have Elevin Nonjera, from the Program Coordinator on Extractive Industries from Oxfam Malawi. Welcome. I have Mariatti Abdullah from Publish What You Pay Indonesia, its National Coordinator. And we have Barnaby Pace, campaigner from Global Witness. And you have their bios in your pack, so you can get to those. So let me just give you a sense of the dynamic for our panel today. So we'll do one round with each panelist, about 7 minutes total for each, where they'll share one or two big challenges they're tackling in a specific country, in the country of focus. They'll talk about an example of how extractive data was used to push for change and talk about some outcomes. Then we'll do another round and discuss what we've learned, and then we'll go to you. So as they're speaking, please jot down questions that you'd like to raise during the Q&A. But before we kick it off, I just want to get a sense of who's in our audience today. So could I see a show of hands for data analysts? Which data analysts do we have in the audience today? You consider yourself a data analyst. Don't be shy. Okay. That's surprising, I have to be honest with you. Okay. How about users of analysis? I would expect a few more hands. Okay, perfect. Okay. Who has worked primarily looking at contracts in the extractive industries? Okay. How about payment data? Revenue data? Great. Beneficial ownership data? Okay. Subnational revenue data? Great. Okay, your coffee's working. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to kick it off with Elevin. And I believe we have time. Great, timekeeping here. So Elevin, welcome. Malawi is an EITI implementing country. It's a small producer of uranium, gemstones, and coal, but there's much excitement and much concern about the potential for oil around Lake Malawi. So can you give us a quick overview of why Oxfam Malawi first became concerned about the oil contracts that were signed in 2014? And what was your approach to influence the transparency and the better oversight of those deals?
Okay, thank you, Isabel. Just to give a picture to people in this room, Malawi is one of the small countries in Southern Africa. We're neighbors with Zimbabwe, we're neighbors with Zambia, Tanzania, and Mozambique. So yes, in 2015, Oxfam in Malawi decided to start implementing around governance and specifically trying to address issues of inequality, but we're also interested in how we can use data to inform some policies that are indeed going to reduce inequality, but also on the other hand, trying to reduce poverty. So historically, Malawi has been an agriculture country. Our economy has relied on agriculture, but we know due to some challenges of climate change and others, as a government is trying to diversify the economy, and mining oil and gas seems to be one of those potential areas for that. So for us as Oxfam, we say that if this is indeed a potential area, then we need to inform policies that are going to help to address, reduce poverty, but also address issues of inequality. So as we started implementing in 2015, we discovered that the government had signed oil contracts, and these contracts were signed in 2014, just a few days before the elections. We're not so much worried about the timing of the signing of the contracts, but we're much interested to see that what indeed was signed, and it was signed under what conditions. So just to give you a better picture, these contracts were signed when Malawi was still using the legislation of 1983 of Petroleum Exploration and Production Act of 1983, and that was in 2014. And at that time, we also didn't have any policy governing the oil sector. And on top of that, there was actually a model petroleum sharing agreement, which was being well developed by the Ministry of Finance together with the Ministry of Mining. So to give you another picture, in Malawi, the mining contracts are signed by, or the custodian is the Ministry of Mines, but the money part is controlled by the Ministry of Finance. So this model petroleum sharing agreement was supposed to act as a guide that when they're negotiating the oil contracts, they should be able to negotiate a good deal. Unfortunately, when this model was about 80% done, when they had invested so much time in it, next morning they heard that, or as we discovered that the oil contracts have been signed, and they have been signed by the Ministry of Mines. Okay, what was contained in this, or what were the variations? One of the items that we picked was that, for example, royalties in the model contract was proposed at 12.5%, but in the signed contracts, it was 5%. This was a bit of a problematic. So for us, yes, we actually, this was the result that we got out of the analysis. And knowing at how controversial this thing was, we decided that we should engage through the multi-stakeholder working group of Malawi AITI. And you know, we are civil society, we always have a wide choices on how we can disseminate this information. We would have wanted to go direct to the public and then to the media, but would we have gotten the attention? So we decided to launch this report through the closed spaces for Malawi AITI Secretariat, the Malawi Stakeholder Working Group, where we had civil society, companies, and also the government. And discussing in that forum, we got a very good reception from the government, and we could actually see the debate between the Ministry of Finance and also the Department of Natural Resources fighting amongst themselves, because we have provided data, we have provided facts and not speculations. So from there, I think there were quite a number of lessons that were drawn. One, in the end, the Ministry of Mines admitted that there were mistakes in signing these contracts, and they would have done a better job. And the Ministry of Finance was also actually quite receptive of the findings of the outcomes of the results, and they actually needed more clarification on they actually told us that we have only focused on, yes, some contents that there was no this law, there was no that, and also royalties was reduced to that, but economically.
Speak a little more slowly.
Oh, sorry. So in details, what does this mean? Can you do an economic analysis so that we can see the differences between the two? So that was like additional work that was given to Oxfam, and we actually took it positively, and to us it was an opportunity to show that indeed civil society, if you give them data, if you give them a chance, they're able to bring out credible information that is going to shape our policies. So eventually we did that economic analysis, and from our analysis, we found out that the model petroleum sharing agreement, the terms that were in there, they were actually rather overambitious. They were not going to be realistic for the companies. But then indeed they were going to bring more revenue for the government, and then it was not going to make any economic sense. On the other hand, the signed contracts, the ones that were signed just a few days before the elections, they were also very generous to the companies, meaning that Malawi was going to lose out. So you can see that already there were some struggles that if we go for oil exploration, most of it's in Lake Malawi. Lake Malawi has livelihoods for a number of people. So if you're negotiating, then you have to negotiate really a good deal that we should maximize revenue generation from it. So just to conclude, our analysis showed that the signed contracts were too generous. The proposed PSA was also not very good, but rather we needed to come in between. And also, even though the government said that they were renegotiating the contracts and they gave us the terms for the renegotiation, they were also not very good in a sense that if you look at oil being found in deep waters, yes, it was not going to make business sense. In shallow waters, maybe they would make some profits. So just to cut the long story short, we proved to the government that you don't have to rush in signing a deal because you can easily be taken advantage of. But rather, take your time, put your house in order, and then you negotiate such important deals which are going to affect us as a nation. So maybe for now, let me conclude it there.
Thanks, Elvin. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time with Elvin to unpack that story, but I hope in your questions we can unpack it a little bit more. We have heard more details over the past couple of days, and I have a few follow-up questions for you when we go to the other round. But let's go to Barnaby. So we know corruption is alive and well in the sector, growing more and more sophisticated, especially as we make more data transparent, corruption adapts. And Global Witness is specializing in shining a light on these dark places. So we've heard how important it is to have transparency on contracting and independent oversight of deals before they're made. But can you speak to how Extractive's data was used to expose corruption in Nigeria's OPL 245 case and some of the lessons and outcomes that you've learned?
Sure. So as you said, Isabella, the extractive sector is believed to be the most corrupt sector on the planet. That's not my opinion, that's the OECD who concluded that. Extractive industry corruption is complex, they're international deals most of the time. Investigating criminality in that sector is very challenging. One case that we've been working on, as you say, has been around this one oil deal for a massive Nigerian oil block called OPL 245. It's an offshore oil block off the coast of the Niger Delta. And essentially, the deal boils down to a $1.1 billion payment in 2011 made by the international oil companies Shell and the Italian oil company Eni in exchange for the rights to this license. The companies claimed that this money was going to the Nigerian government at the time. In fact, the money was never going to stay with the Nigerian government. It was diverted off into private pockets of a company that was anonymously owned called Malawi Oil and Gas, a Nigerian company that turned out, with not terribly much investigation, to be owned by Nigeria's former oil minister, who'd given the block to himself and his cronies, including the former president's son at the time and others. So that first stage is quite illustrative. The classic challenge in investigating all white-collar crime, and frankly a lot of other crime these days as well, is finding out who really controls corporate vehicles, piercing the corporate veil. Happily, beneficial ownership transparency is now in place in the UK, coming online throughout the EU, and actually just this week, the House of Representatives here passed a bill that would create beneficial ownership transparency for US companies, and the US is not least of the problems with anonymous company ownership. The Shell and Eni denied knowing that this payment was going to Dan Atete, this former oil minister, But we were able to publish leaked emails over the years that showed that senior executives at both companies were fully aware that their payments were going to this former oil minister, who I should mention as well, at the time was also a convicted money launderer. What has been established since then is that out of that 1.1 billion payment, according to prosecutors, $520 million was turned into cash and used to bribe Nigerian public officials, including allegedly the president, the oil minister, the attorney general, and others. To put that in some context, if you had $520 million in cash and you had it on $100 bills, so the most efficient way you could do it, it would weigh over 5 tons just in cash. Now, we've taken this a step further over the years, working with our partners in Nigeria, in Italy, in the UK, to look into the business advantage secured by these companies. Not only did they secure this incredibly promising oil block, but the terms on which they gained that block are crucial. And we were very lucky to be able to work with Don and his team of analysts and get hold of leaked copies of contracts, the company's own valuations and development plans, things that are nearly always secret. In Nigeria, actually even just contracts are almost secret. Even model contracts are nearly always secret in Nigeria. But we were able to analyze those contracts to show that compared to the standard oil terms in place in Nigeria at the time, this contract gave effectively $5.8 billion in projected tax breaks over the lifetime of the block. And to put that in context, that's twice the federal health and education budgets in Nigeria combined. And that's in a country where 1 in 10 children don't live to their 5th birthday. So this is an incredibly important, massive deal. And we've been able to use tracking of where the payments were diverted, beneficial ownership, contract analysis to try and shine light on it. Those exposés over the years have led to criminal investigations in at least 6 jurisdictions, including here in the US, Italy, the UK, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Nigeria, and has led to a massive criminal trial currently ongoing in Milan, where Shell, Eni, and some of their most senior executives, including the CEO of Eni, the former number 2 at Shell, Dan Tete, the former oil minister, and others are standing trial on international corruption charges and face 7-year jail terms, unlimited criminal damages, as Nigeria is also suing for the company's role. I should say that they all deny wrongdoing. All the defendants in the trial are pleading innocent. The other officials who have not been charged, such as Nigeria's former president, have denied wrongdoing in the case. This does, however, raise serious questions about how law enforcement can use this data, how well-resourced these agencies can be. In this case, it's a positive example. We don't know how many more out there that we've never caught because we didn't have the data. Even in this case, we've relied on leaks and on reporting before the data became available. But this case has been crucial in opening up that space. When the European transparency law went through the parliament there, the closing speech was saying that the European law had to pass the OPL 245 test. It had to provide exactly this kind of transparency to expose this kind of deal. So it's been really powerful in opening up this space, and ultimately, we can't assume that transparency automatically leads to accountability. As Danny was saying earlier, zombie data is a real thing. You have to analyze it, and it has to be put to use. And ultimately, we're only going to have a cleaner system where systems get a better deal and companies are deterred from and can be held to account by iconic cases where people are made to answer for the deals they've done.
Thanks, Barnaby. I think what's also just one commentary on this, I think it's worth mentioning that the first public mention of this case was around
1998 is when the block was first allocated, and it was rumored that this oil minister was the owner of the anonymous company within a year.
So, and just a personal story, in the time that they were investigating this case, I was leading the Publish What You Pay United States Coalition. We were in the midst of advocating for Section 1504 for a U.S. transparency oil and gas transparency law, but also the implementation of regulations, Shell and Eni were not helpful in that process. And what's interesting is that one of the arguments that we heard from the opposition to this law was that we've got plenty of anti-bribery, anti-corruption legislation, and it's effective. So I think one key message for us during that process was that you have very visible, listed U.S. companies not that long ago going, when we have the existence of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, taking these sorts of very obvious risks. So it gives you a sense of the holes within our anti-corruption legislation that companies will work through. So thanks very much, Barnaby. We'll come back to that in just a moment. So Mariatti, you and I know each other for a long time. I think it's worth noting that Mariatti has outlasted 2 Indonesian governments and 7 natural resources ministers. So, and I would encourage folks to check out Publish What You Pay Indonesia's work, their website. They are a force to be reckoned with. So really pleased and honored to have you on this panel. So let's turn from contracting and licensing to monitoring and protecting revenues to be invested in local development projects. Indonesia has a rich experience with oil and mining booms, and these booms drove the tension and the revenue sharing inequalities between national and subnational governments that then helped to drive the decentralization reforms that were so fundamental to the history of the country. Could you talk about the innovation in the district village funds that emerged from that period and share a few examples of where you've leveraged that innovation to follow oil and gas revenues and increase their accountability?
Thank you, Isabel. I agree with the context of the corruption risks along the value chain of industry extractive. As we know that Indonesia, we already phased out from oil boom, but we still have abundance of natural resources now with also tin, copper, and also gold, nickel as well. But if you're talking about investigations of corruption, I'm talking about prevention side. Because from transparency, where Indonesia be EATI member from 2010, and then we're using data from EATI. We do triangulation with the production and sales data, and we also are working with the Ministry and Anti-Corruption Commission in the preventive side. We do coordination and supervision with the provincial government in the mineral and gold sectors. So this one case of using data, we do such audit because we already has from 2009 until 2012 the booming of licensing on mineral and coal very huge, almost 11,000 of license launched by the subnational government because we have decentralization on licensing as well. And then through this ground checking, and also we check the revenue tax and we check their compliant level of the payment to the governments and also post-mining rehabilitation fund. From 2014 until 2018, government revoked about 6,000 license, which is non-clean and clear. Why non-clean and clear? Because there is a lack of due diligence to give license, and also provincial and district governments, to some extent, they are involved in the what we call it like a bribery in the licensing, and also the political exposed persons of local government who give license, and many other modus. And this is the one story in the mineral and coal. Let me jump to the oil and gas in terms of the revenue. With the concept of, because oil and gas following the normal curve, which is when the windfall revenue coming down, the national and subnational, particularly for subnational, producer district, they are very huge money, and they supposed to be has a big capacity to spend, and also what happens if they cannot spend the money itself. So this is the big question for the district level resource risk. Coming from transparency, we do technical assistance and also capacity building with the local community and local governments. And when we open the contract of PST, we can see the split of government entitlements, contractual entitlement, and other things. But we cannot find and access the information and product on cost recovery, which is in terms of cost. Why local government and community need cost information? Because they need to predict how many money that will be going to the district, be to the local budget and other financial system management and other things. But until now, we cannot access the cost recovery. But through the supreme audit of the central government, some of the cost recovery we can access. And then we still trying to open the cost recovery in the EATI report. But another thing, in terms of the innovation, we just, some of data not closed, it not means that we need, we cannot do anything, but we can do innovation. Because we embedded the model of revenue sharing to the village level, from central to subnational to the provincial and district level. We create local regulations to redistribute a certain percentage of money from district to the village level based on the ring area of radius on the wellhead, the location of the village itself. Like we in Bojonegoro district and also in Pelalawan of Rio province, where Pelalawan is being the top 10 district, resource-rich district who receive money from oil and gas in Indonesia. And because we working with the champion, with the community and local governments, so the formula of village funds also coming from oil and gas.
Sorry, 1 minute, Mariatti.
Yeah, I think those kind of the yeah, with the concept of not just creating a formula of revenue sharing to the village level, but also we need to make sure the patterns and also the allocation of the money from oil and gas going the right way. We working with the local government to make sure the midterm development plan, as in the concept of oil and gas as resource mobilization in the district level, we put when the peak productions, for example, in the period of midterm 5 and long-term 25 development plan in the district level, what kind of the indicator of human development quality that you wanted to achieve. That's the one thing. And the second thing, if we wanted to achieve the number of human development index, what should be developed in terms of infrastructure, in terms of education, in terms of health and other things. So the one case in Pelalawan is the one from the number 2 poorest district among 12 districts in Rio province. Rio province is the richest province of oil and gas in Indonesia, but the Pelalawan is the 2 poorest district among 12. And local government setting the tone in terms of how many percentage of poverty that they wanted to decrease and what kind of the program development they need to build through this village fund. Thank you.
Mariatti, obviously you can see Mariatti has a lot of experience to share, and I think some of the really innovative work that they're doing to really look at the local level, look at human development targets, and try to match the revenues coming in with those targets, and look at all the different innovations that have been brought in through the decentralization process to make sure those revenues are going the right direction. Also, I know there's a lot of folks interested in your work on cost and cost transparency. But I think moving to our colleague Don Hubert, who specializes in looking at revenue risks. Don, you're the president of Res4Dev, and it's a consulting firm that Oxfam and other colleagues have worked with for many years now. And you provide civil society with industry standard economic analysis and revenue forecasting advice. You've got a long history in Mozambique, and that offers an important cautionary tale of why transparency is so important. Maybe you could talk to us about that case and some of the lessons that you're learning and what you see coming ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Mozambique's a fascinating country, I would say that. It also draws out some important lessons, I think, for the wider sector and the kind of analysis that we're all engaged in. The extractive sector is a capital-intensive sector, and anytime you read that, you should read no jobs, very few spin-off benefits. The prize for governments and for communities and for citizens is ultimately in revenues. We need to make sure that the sale of non-renewable assets ultimately can be converted into human and social development. Many of you are familiar with the resource curse, and one of the prominent dimensions of the resource curse as it was first articulated maybe 15 years ago was too much money too fast. And we can find a few places where that's actually happened, but in our work, fairly systematically, we see too little money coming in too slow. And Mozambique's an example of that. So in 2010, 2011, there were stunning natural gas finds offshore in the north of Mozambique, the Rovuma Basin. And there was a very quick assumption that this could be turned into huge government revenues very fast. There was a cable from a U.S. economic analyst back to the State Department that said, and I quote, "By 2014, experts suggest that natural resource revenues could outstrip foreign assistance." Well, foreign assistance was $2.3 billion US that year. And I can assure you that natural resource revenues have not gotten anywhere close to that, to this stage. There were a series of revenue projections then that were put out that were very optimistic, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those in contrast to our own work. But those revenue forecasts, fueling this sense that the money was just around the corner, played a pivotal role in a debt crisis that has crippled the economy of the country. $2 billion borrowed on the European bond market, with the assumption that this could be paid back quickly. And for those of you who followed that debate, the first of those bonds has just been renegotiated with payback starting in 2029 and 2030. So that gives you a little bit of a sense about what I'm going to say. So we undertook a study for Oxfam. We've done work on Mozambique for 7 or 8 years now, but we undertook a recent study for Oxfam that will be published soon about the first project that has reached final investment decision, and it's a floating LNG project that will be led by the Italian oil company Eni, the same one that Barnaby had mentioned. In terms of data, happily, Mozambique has published the contracts, and so most of the fiscal terms that we need to know are in the public domain. I would say, just as a methodological point, that if you want to understand projects, you have to do comprehensive project economic analysis, and this means you need a lot of data. This is our day job, it's what we do, and like other industry analysts, we have lots of ways of finding that information, but it's very challenging in a lot of cases for civil society groups because, as was mentioned, for example, cost data is often not easily available. So what were our findings on this study? When we benchmark these kinds of deals, let's say, we look really at 3 things. What's the government take? How much of the share is the government going to get? When do they get it? And what are the risks that actually those revenue forecasts really aren't going to emerge because of corporate efforts to minimize taxes? On the first point, the government take, I would say, is comparatively low. But that's not a huge problem in the case of Mozambique because the size of the resource is so great, right? If you are selling vast numbers of something and your profit margin's a little bit lower, you can still generate a lot of money. Much more worrying is the rear-loaded nature of these contracts, and this is the ultimate finding of the study, that although production will start probably in 2023, revenues don't become really significant until sometime in the early or even mid-2030s. That's a long time to wait for revenues, and there are good metrics for analyzing the timing of revenues, but it's an under-analyzed dimension of what we might call a fair deal. And then finally, when we look at the question about risks to those revenues, one of the concerns we have is that when we look at revenue forecasts that have been generated in the past and we correct them for commodity prices, which of course you have to do, governments rarely get what they should or what they were expecting. And the reason for this is that there are many pathways to revenue loss. If it's an area of interest with Publish What You Pay, I wrote a piece called Many Ways to Lose $1 Billion, which tries to articulate exactly those dimensions. So let me just draw a kind of higher level conclusion here on what's going wrong. the Australian Institute for Minerals and Metallurgy, or Mining and Metallurgy, did a study of feasibility studies. And you won't be surprised to hear that what they found is that companies systematically overestimate how quickly they can produce and how much they will produce. They overestimate the price at which they'll sell it, and they underestimate the costs at which that it will cost to produce. Now, you do not need a PhD in economics to know that that set of scenarios overstates profitability. And the same thing happens with governments, with one big exception, which is that they have a whole set of tax rules that they also have to factor into their analysis. And those tax rules often have loopholes that usually aren't built into the front end of revenue forecasts. And I could go into details on each of those different elements and show you why the early revenue forecasts were so bad or so inaccurate. And I say that cautiously because we're predicting a future that is unknowable. But there are certain patterns, there are certain systematic elements that are knowable. So it's not a great assumption, for example, to say that Mozambique will be able to develop an LNG sector faster than Qatar or Australia. That just seems to me to be a bad assumption. And it's probably worth taking into account when you pick a future LNG price that you're doing it in a period right after the Fukushima nuclear disaster and that LNG prices that are at an all-time high. And similarly, it's a good thing to read the Annex C of the production sharing contracts and to find out that debt financing has no restrictions and is cost recoverable. It's a big loophole. It's going to cost the government billions. So these are predictable elements, and we should factor them into our analysis because revenue forecasts can be dangerous things. Bad revenue forecasting, I strongly believe, fueled the debt crisis in Mozambique. It gave them confidence that the money was just around the corner. And of course, if the money's around the corner but it's not quite there yet, how do you monetize it today? You borrow. And even the borrowing, I believe, was actually a fairly predictable risk that should have been taken into account. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Don. Great, a lot for us to chew on. Okay, so in terms of timing, we're pretty good on time. So we're going to spend, we're going to go back to our panel, another round. You've heard each other's presentations as well. I know there's more that you can share. But maybe we'll start with Elevin again, and we'll just go around. And what I was hoping you could talk about is, what have you learned? What are the lessons that you're drawing from your experience? And anything else you'd like to comment on what others have said here. I'm asking for folks to have 5 minutes each, and your time will be noted right over here by our friend Christina.
All right, thank you, Isabel. One of the most important lessons that we've learned in this is that it's very, for a long time as civil society or as people, we do ask for information, but if you just ask for it, for example, we ask for contract transparency, if we're given, then we keep them on our desk, let them gather dust, then we are not proving a point on why we should be given information. So let's move away from just asking for information, but focus more on what you do with that information. So for us, in this case, we ask for the contracts, we analyze them, and then we review some loopholes. And secondly, most of the times we also focus more on giving recommendations after we have done our analysis. But I would say that our lesson from this is that focus more on the facts and implications discussed together, unlike giving recommendations. Because mostly when you're giving recommendations, they feel like you already had a side and that study was already diverting towards that direction. I'll give an example in this way. Our conclusion from the contract analysis was that let's cancel the contract. That was the best recommendation that would give. But what would that recommendation have implications, or what would be the implications of that? There were quite many. One, as the government, we were also exposing our government to lose money that they're not even sure that they were going to have. Because this oil exploration, we're just exploring, we're not sure if we have the oil or not. We've already made a mistake by signing bad contracts. But if we recommend that, no, let's cancel them and then we compensate the companies, then there's nothing good for Malawians. And as an organization, we're also just promoting inequality. So what we did, as I said, we just presented the facts, and in that room as the MSD, we're debating together. So what do we do?
MSD.
Oh, sorry, as the EITI multi-stakeholder working group, we're discussing that how do we move out of this fate? So anyway, we are able to overcome that, or we're able to pass through that, because one of the contracts for block number 6 that was also signed, the company has decided to relinquish the block because they are not sure of the fine if indeed oil is there. So it saved us from making the government lose money, but on the other hand, there's nothing that we're paying out of it. So that's one of the best outcomes. And then for the other 2 contracts, it's still not sure if the company is proceeding, and also the company, because our analysis showed that in different scenarios, the company can win or can lose. So it's also the company that is pushing the government that we should have the contracts renegotiated. So I still want to focus on that. I mean, to emphasize on that recommendations, sometimes let's be smart. Let's give facts and details, and less on recommendations, and together we'll come up with recommendations. And secondly, or finally, also be patient. Most of the times when we have that, we have findings, we want action to be taken right there and then. But through this process, we have learned that patience is one important key, especially if you're influencing policy.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Over to Barnaby, your reflections on lessons learned.
Sure. Well, a couple of things. So one thing is the time and resources that it takes to get to the bottom of these issues. I've been working on this specific case for 7 years. Global Witness has been working on it longer than that. Again, there's OECD statistics that say the typical anti-corruption case takes on average 7 years, which at times I would say is optimistic. So we've started getting some of this data very recently. Payment transparency data from the EU we've had for a couple of years now, 2-3 years. Mm-hmm. Beneficial ownership's just coming in, and there's still very much a developing thing of that there's still flaws in it and loopholes that need to be filled, and people only getting the hang of using it. Things like contracts are still wildly unavailable in most parts of the world, even as the standards have improved. Don't expect the next day after this data becomes available that the massive scandal will break. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of work and a lot of upskilling to be able to understand, analyze, and find what's gone wrong there. That said, the other thing I've learned over the years, it's often worse than you thought it was. One might think might be quite cynical about these things, but I'm shocked really frequently at how brazen and how bad the situation can be in the case of major corporations that you'd think were very sophisticated, very risk averse, major economies leaders getting up to things I'm still shocked by. I mentioned earlier we published leaked emails from inside Shell that were leaked to us. And it showed clearly that their most senior executives were briefed that the money they were paying was going to go out in bribes. And this was written in formal briefing memos ahead of phone calls and after meetings and so on. We've got a copy of our latest report outside, and so you can read verbatim some of those emails in there. I was shocked when Don came back with the findings from his modelling on the contracts after we were able to get hold of them and pull this all together and upskill ourselves enough to ask the right question of what's gone wrong here, and coming back with these figures of multi-billion-dollar losses compared to previous deals in pace or compared to the standard deal. I was shocked. I was shocked when I saw letters from civil servants saying this is a highly prejudicial deal to the interests of Nigeria, written 2 weeks before the deal was done by the most senior civil servant on oil in the country, and yet they were ignored. This still shocks me. And I think that it is not a unique case. I think it would be, it's certainly a big case, it's a major case, and it's the largest corporate corruption trial in history as far as I can find out. But that doesn't mean it's unique. This is happening in other places with other companies, with other people. The last thing I'd say is that I think we're here talking about Africa in theory in the title, but actually this is a massive issue all around the world in every resource-rich country. And that's not just in Africa, it's not just in Southeast Asia, it's also in the US. The US, of all new oil and gas production in the world for the next decade, over 60% of it is going to be in the US, which is a massive issue from the climate perspective because the research shows that we can't exploit any of that and keep within 1.5 degrees. But it's also a big problem because the US does not get a very good deal from its own oil and gas. We've gone around and shouted about how Nigeria should have gone 60 or 65 or up to 85% of the revenues from their oil deals, and this loss is tied to a criminal case. The average in the US for the US government revenue from oil and gas deals is in the 50s, in the 50%. So actually this makes a difference here and in the UK and in other resource-rich countries in the north, and this is not merely about what the problem is over there. This is about our corporations working here and our natural resources here and the decisions that are made that are impacting on the whole world with whether we should be moving forward with those kind of projects in the light of issues like climate change. So I think there's broader perspectives than sometimes we allow ourselves to think about.
Thanks, Barnaby. I think that reality check is always very good. We're always wanting to celebrate the advances we are able to make in this situation, but we need to remain vigilant and actually a little bit cynical, because this is not focused on one region. It's worldwide. It's a pattern, a systematic pattern of behavior. Could we go to Mariati? Thanks.
I think it's starting from read the contract and also starting from going to the detail on the data is making our local government and also community trying to improve the leveling of asking of transparency. In the beginning, they asking why district level just receive 6% from the central governments and many things, so talking about percentage. But after we read the contract and trying to do how the formula and how the money going to the district, we're talking about, oh, there is a miss on data of product cost and many things. And I echoing with John talking about modeling. It's interesting because I think it's provide more option for the governments. Do they want to build how many huge project of infrastructure, although they wanted to borrow or not, as long as they know the consequence itself. Because they can predict, for example, the very important thing, the local community and also the local government, they can predict how many money they will get and also how many risks they can maintain, because the volatility and other in terms of the oil characteristic. And in this, as a lesson learned, I think this is very important why project by project level working in the ground, because we can access more aggregate data. If local government wanted to do projection, they need the disaggregate data from the central government, because in this Pelalawan case, for example, there are 2 blocks by state-owned company and other multinational company, and in Bojonegoro there are 2 or 3 by state-owned company, PetroChina and also Exxon. If we didn't get the disaggregate data, they cannot do project for each block. They just do very general. This is like similar from the national budget, from the state audited, and also other information. There is no value added from this data, and I think. Through the transparency, through the data, this is also create a dialogue. And to some extent, from the dialogue process, from the trying to capacity building to improve the skill and also to see how high the risk, how much money they need to maintain, what also how expectation of the community in terms of the money and other thing. It's also try to thinking about the innovations. Because in this case of village funds, it's a normal public management financial system. Because and the district level, the regions, they have space of discretion of policy on other law on village fund. So they thinking about why we not do benefit sharing for more based on the community and village in surrounding mining and surrounding wellhead, producer block and other things. I think this is great innovation. And the last, my lesson learned is also working in collaborate with the civil society. We stand in the national in Jakarta. It's very far from Rio, 2 hours flight and also 4 hours through road. But the very important modalities is local partner, civil society, and also community center. We also setting the community center not like civil society very organized and other, but also community. They are women, they are farmer, they are also old men, and also religious group and other thing. Also indigenous people. So this is the interesting that we need to be working with. And when we didn't have time and also energy to do to continuing this effort, because this village fund from oil and gas starting in 2017 and now already in the 3rd years, we wanted to see how the impact of this kind of innovation to the local communities. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Mariatti. I think those lessons are so crucial. I mean, especially, we'll talk more about this, you know, disaggregated project by project, date payments, contract is so crucial for local governments that are trying to do financial modeling to predict the timing and volume of revenues. That's fundamental. And the idea around data, creating dialogue to find innovations, and the collaborations with civil society, indigenous peoples, women's rights groups as being crucial in that dialogue. I think these are really important lessons. Don, could you talk to us about lessons you've learned?
Yeah, thank you.
Feel free to comment on.
I'll cluster them around 3 ideas, and I'm picking up many themes that have already been there. And the first one, and it may seem strange with the title behind me, but I worry about the word data, because we have increased our sophistication and we no longer talk simplistically about transparency leading to anything. Data being set free doesn't do work on its own. We have to talk much more about knowledge and analysis, I think. Just as a kind of analogy, I was doing a presentation a couple of years back, and I was thinking, you know, if we think about the public health world, no one would ever take raw public health data and put it in front of civil society or communities and have them figure out what they should do in the health sector. But we do that in the extractive sector, and it's strange. In most fields, there are established methodologies for analyzing raw data and for producing actionable findings. And the big part of the work is to develop a cadre of effective consumers of that knowledge who can then move it forward in a policy debate. And I think that we need some kind of a similar kind of theory of change in the work that we're doing. I strongly believe, and this is echoing several of the comments, that that analysis needs to be done at the project level. We work for a bunch of governments. They frequently say, we've got a problem in our sector, no one's paying corporate tax. And I say, but actually some are paying corporate tax and others aren't. And if you don't know the difference between those two, you've got a real problem. You've got to understand the projects. And we've got probably 20 case studies, of which probably half of them are on the public domain on the website, like the ones we've been discussing here. Second cluster of comments then around the importance of contracts, because obviously I'm delighted that it's become part of the EITI standard going forward, delighted about resourcecontracts.org. But I think many people who do this work still don't understand the fundamental importance of knowing the deal. If you don't know the deal, you can't do serious analysis. You can't make any sense out of revenue payment data, because the payment data only comes because of the fiscal terms that are contained in most countries that I work on in contracts. And let me just make a comment about how important just transparency is, and I'm actually going against myself here in one small way in saying that transparency on its own actually works on contracts. There is a clause in the Malawi contract that says 1 year after the effective signing date of this contract, the government will negotiate a reduction to the corporate income tax rate, period. That sentence cannot survive being in the public domain. It's crazy. I never imagined that I would see that in a contract that was signed in 2014. The OPL 245 contract could not have survived the light of day. Secrecy in Nigeria is a disaster. In fact, the tax authority doesn't have the right to see the oil contracts in Nigeria. Yeah? Shocking. We're doing some work at the moment in Congo-Brazzaville, which is, let's say, not noted for high levels of governance. But all of their contracts are published in the National Gazette. And whatever the problems in that sector, the problems aren't in the contracts, mostly. And then a last comment, that we live in a data-poor environment. And I think sometimes we do a disservice by talking about the billions of dollars that we're capturing in the data sets. And I mean, I'm partly guilty of this. With NRGI, we published a piece on contract disclosure, and we tried to make it a forward-leaning report to show that there's an emerging norm. But of course, if you really care about oil revenues in Africa, you want contract transparency in Angola and in Nigeria and in Equatorial Guinea. And if you're looking to new producers, you want it in Tanzania or Kenya or Uganda, and we don't have it in any of those countries. But it's not just contracts. We need the project economic data. And I really feel at the moment like we can analyze the projects where we can find the data, but in many cases, those aren't the projects that are most important to the countries that we're working in. There's a report that's going to come out on the Dominican Republic, which is a very unusual alignment. It's the best public domain data I've ever seen, and it's a $4.5 billion mine, one of the largest gold mines in the Americas. But very rarely does that happen. It happened on OPL 245 as well. Why is that the case? Because of all the lawsuits that were out there that collected all the documents, and then very clever and effective people like Barnaby and his colleagues who find ways to tap into, let's say, informal disclosure. I'm a big fan of informal disclosure. But just a final comment on, even in very challenging circumstances, it is possible in some cases to do really interesting work. We did some analysis for Transparency International trying to demonstrate the value of data being in the public domain. And we scoured 700 producing projects that were reporting, and we tried to winnow it down to ones that we could actually say something really interesting about. And one of them, and I'll just close on this really quick example, is Equatorial Guinea. So I got in touch with civil society, people who work on Equatorial Guinea, and they laughed at me. They said, there's no way you'll ever be able to do anything on the oil sector in Equatorial Guinea. But it turns out that Tullow not only reports under the EU directive for an oil block in Equatorial Guinea, they also provide pretty decent broken down production data. And then it turns out that Hess was a partner in that same oil block, and they also had good production data and even a little bit of cost data. And then you go to resourcecontracts.org, and it's a hard slog, but you find out that Ceiba and Okum, the two oil fields, are actually in what used to be called Block G, and Block G used to be held by an American company named Triton, who put it on the US stock exchange. And when I was helping find those early contracts, we found it on the Edgar system. So suddenly, in one of the most opaque countries in the world, you've got a contract, you got production data, you got revenue payment data, you got a little bit of cost data, and you can start to put together the story. And we published it, and I think that for the community, there's still a strong push towards showing that there are weaknesses in the reporting requirements, and that was the emphasis that Transparency International took. But I think it's a really example of how you can start to force a degree of, certainly not accountability, but at least exposure in some very dark places. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Okay, I think we've got a lot to chew on for our Q&A. I'd like to take 2 or 3 questions, and we'll just do a few rounds, as many as we can. I think we've got 20 minutes. Yeah, okay. Could I get 2 or 3 questions from the audience? Okay, cool. Here and over here. Lucas here. Over here. Please introduce yourself.
So for those who joined late, I'm Brahima Kulubali, the director of the Africa program. I think I want to underscore Don's point, and it's consistent with some findings in our research that's going to be published next month, that there's an increased tendency to really overestimate the size and then to underestimate the timing to start getting revenue. And what's worse is when government begins to act on that and begin contracting sovereign debt. You mentioned Mozambique. We've also seen it in the case of Ghana.
Yes.
I think from my vantage point as a think tank, we're very much interested in this area. So my question to you, who are sort of advocates, is where do you see the research gaps that can be most useful in advancing the agenda in this sector? Because by our independence rules, we can't be advocates, but we very much are committed to impact of what we do So if you can share with us your views on where research can be most useful, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Great question. And here in the second row?
Hi, I'm Will Simon. I work for Search for Common Ground, a nonprofit. And my question is sort of broad. It's whether, given all the potential for corruption that you all have talked about, given all the environmental risks, as well as the potential harm that can come to communities most directly affected by mining projects, I'm wondering whether you all think that mining is still an area of development that governments should put time and energy and resources into developing, whether it sort of going forward will bring net benefits to governments, or whether they should redirect their efforts elsewhere.
Also a great question. Thanks. And I think we have Mukasiri in the back. Just one more for this round, and then we'll go back to our panel.
Thank you very much. Banda Mukasiri is my name, from Zimbabwe. 2 questions. 2009, realizing that Africa is not getting a fair share of sustainable development dividend from the extraction of resources, they adopted the Africa Mining Vision. We are here talking about what ways we can improve how resources can be managed. But I'm not seeing any interaction with the policy document that the African Union adopted. Because it would also be good to tie these conversations, to influence policies, to say, yes, we are doing this and we are looking at what is the benchmarking on what the African heads of state agreed to. So I think that's something that we also need to do as we discuss this conversation, so that we don't create a parallel policy framework which will not be listened to by some of the African heads of state. Then the second bit is about, yes, I agree in terms of we need to fight more, we need to do more to fight corruption and more revenue. But from my experience, even the little that is coming in is not being put to good use. So how do we balance that effort of saying, let's look out for more revenue, but at the same time, having that surety that if we get more, it can translate to more gains?
Great, thank you, Mukasiri. Okay, maybe I'll start from the end over. Barnaby?
Sure, so very quickly, yeah, thank you for your good questions. To combine your research question and how is mining and extraction a good target for development, I would say that extraction is going to happen, especially mining. There's so many different types of minerals. We need all these products, and extraction, even on things like fossil fuels, is not going to end overnight, even if we need to transition in that direction. And how the energy transition, how the change in demand for minerals is going to alter our society and alter these economies, I think is the most pressing issue of our times. I don't feel in a position, and I think it's very hard as someone based in a wealthy northern country that's benefited from the Industrial Revolution and the fossil fuel boom, to go to Nigeria and say, don't exploit your oil, because there is an urgent need for money for development. However, they need answers for what they're going to do instead, because ultimately fossil fuels is not going to be a solution to development problems in those countries. And on the other hand, some of the minerals and some of the products we need for the energy transition could be, if we correct the mistakes of the past, a useful route to development. And I think it's going to happen to a certain extent, so let's make sure that it's not corrupt and it gets good deals. And that's why this transparency and accountability is still so important for so many issues. Mukasiri, to translate to gains, just to fill in one gap for where this money goes, is it doesn't stay in the country, right? It flows out, and it flows out to places like New York, Washington, D.C., London, Paris, all these other places. And so one of the key elements that we haven't mentioned is making sure that we don't provide safe havens for corrupt money. If you've stolen a load of money, you don't want to stay in the place you've just stolen from. usually the hospitals are pretty crap as well, and you want to send your kids to better schools, and you want to live in a place where that money can't be taken back away from you. So you go to London or you go to New York and you buy nice houses and yachts and aircraft and all the rest, and the fight against that is still very much a work in progress. The US is passing things like beneficial ownership legislation could be a big step forward in preventing that illicit money flowing into places like the US and around the world using US companies. And I think that's an angle that people in this room and people in the global north can work on to make sure that the kleptocrat, wherever they may be from, can't enjoy their wealth in comfort elsewhere, and it deters that theft in the first place, hopefully.
Thanks. Mariati?
A very good question and also difficult. I want you to start from the last, Mukasiri. I think in terms of the document or also policy reform that we need to influence, I think in the downstream or spending side, we need to intervene and also make sure the midterm development plan in the district level is quite good and also long term for the 25 or more than that. And also to calculate the oil variable to the midterm development plan, because I see many district level didn't do that, and this is very risk. And secondly, in the policy reform, in the policy document like development planning and budget, we need to put the other in the risk thing. So how to mitigate the risk of oil in the development plant. And the second question, in terms of the potential risk of corruption, environment impact, and also resource development, I think whether the government or also the authority in the country see this as, I think to be careful, we need to be careful and rational. We have many countries, they have constitutions. Where the theory or the concept of the natural resource owned by the state and also should be benefiting the people. So make sure the policy framework can be mitigate those risks, mitigate the environment, mitigate the corruption, and also mitigate the misspending, because this money coming fast and also going fast, so very risk on corruption, particularly if the democracy and the political system and institutionalization and institution system in the country is not quite good, and also the civic participations to monitor the independent of anti-corruption institution also be the one thing. So that's more rational. And secondly, because this is, I see in many levels, this is a trap. I think it's very difficult what kind of trap, how to calculate the risk, how to maintain the risk, and also the very important is the political in the local, and also how to maintain the expectation of people in terms of the mining, in terms of the oil. This is very important. The research gap, I'm very interested with it, these questions. What I see, I think more on the political economy research, how to setting the institutional among, and not just institution on to running the development itself, but also the good governance in the country level, because this sector in many rich countries and also region, they are very near with the problem on untransparency, oligarch of the political economic relations. So I don't know how the research can be more push the recommendation to strengthen the institution of political economic setting in the country level. And in the community and subnational, I want you to see how the strength role of community and society to to be part of the actor in this in surrounding mining. I mean, this is not just a gap of capacity, but also how we set the role, the strong role of the community and society in the ground level, because this is very important. I mean, in terms of the democratization and also to some extent the concept of natural resource as the tools of redistribution. I mean, how the participation of strong participation of community and society in the very ground level can be setting up, be a collective actions to make sure this natural resource is benefiting the people. Because I see the gap, there are many research, there are many innovations, is coming from the middle level of province, national, and international perhaps, but don't leave the community in surrounding mining, because we see many inequality, many poverty, many environment impact, directly impact to the people. So talking the people, talking the surrounding mining itself, and also talking the concept of the big social economic, also talking the fiscal management system in the national and also regional level.
Thanks, Mariotti.
Okay, thank you. I'll start by answering the question from my friend from Search for Common Grounds. The question is, should we continue to mine looking at all these challenges? For a country like Malawi, which is still under development, the answer is yes, because we're still developing, and most of our minerals, they're industrial minerals. And if we can focus on that, maybe that would help us to develop our country. We need them. But when do we mine? I feel like we shouldn't be like we are in rush for anything. We need to put our house in order first. We need to put in the legislation, the policies that are going to promote sustainable mining. And with that, then we can proceed. And there's actually this common saying that we say in our country that minerals, they never rot, they never go bad. So you can keep them as long as you want. Until you put your house in order. So for us, the most important thing is that we have the legislation, the policy guidelines that are safeguarding our minerals, and they are also promoting sustainable development. And also just to attempt Mukasiri's question about the African mining vision, as Malawi, we are actually appreciating both instruments. We have the EITI, we have the African mining vision, and at present we're also developing like the country mining vision. And the approach that we have taken is that we're not prioritizing anyone over the other, but we are focusing on both. For example, the country mining vision is the Ministry of Mines that is facilitating that, whilst the EITI is sitting in the Ministry of Finance. But we look at these two instruments as something that do complement each other. And if we have these strong instruments, indeed it's going to help to develop the country. And yeah, I think those are the two that I wanted to attempt. Thank you.
Thank you. Don.
Thanks. I mean, the research question is a very big one. Let me throw out a couple of ideas. I'd love to see someone do comprehensive research on the gap between what countries expected to get and what they actually get. Mm-hmm. We know a whole lot of cases in a lot of detail, and the news is almost always bad. But that's anecdotal. I can say it for 20 cases that I know well. But I think systematic work would be useful there. I'd love to see someone do an analysis of EITI data to just tell us how many projects or how many companies have never paid profit-based tax. Everyone knows the scandals that happened in Tanzania around the gold mining sector. And Acacia, the mine at the epicenter of that controversy, Bulyanhulu, produced for 16 years and never was assessed $1 of corporate tax. When I talk to my team, I say, if that was my project, I would cheat to pay some tax, because a zero for 16 years is socially unsustainable. But there's a data set out there that could be checked. I'd love to see people do some real work on transfer pricing. I see books written about transfer mispricing without a single case referenced. I spent months compiling what I think is the best collection of public domain cases on pathways to revenue loss, in many ways to lose $1 billion, and I can assure you that it's really hard to find real cases. But real cases are powerful, like Barnaby's kind of example. Real cases of real problems are powerful tools. I'd love to know why lessons are observed but not learned. I used to be a global policy person, used to be a Canadian diplomat. And I had a lot of confidence in the power of global norms until I started working on natural resource revenue issues in specific countries. And I have a lot less confidence in those norms now. Even countries like Ghana, and Oxfam has done spectacular work there, and great partners and strong civil society and really good research institutes and all the rest of it. And still, when we look at questions of debt, it didn't all go so well. Okay, a quick comment then on mining, and I will spin it out to oil and gas. In my less optimistic moments, and they do come around, I believe that the concentration of wealth and power in these sectors makes them, there is at least a risk that they are ungovernable. When I look at the extraordinary success of the campaigners and the rest, and I weigh that up against the opportunities that exist for elites to steal. I would like us to stop using rent-seeking as a term. I mean, it's theft. And the opportunities for that are great, and the governance and institution mechanisms are weak, and what outsiders can do is often overstated. The Africa Mining Vision. I find this a challenging document because it doesn't talk about tax. I have pored over that document looking for negotiate a really good deal, audit companies to get your fair share. I can find a glimmer in a few sentences. And here I really worry that there's a struggle over discourse. Yeah? And the discourse that companies want is anything but the money. Right? We should remember first off that no mining oil and gas company exists for mining or oil and gas. They exist to turn a profit. That's their purpose. And they would much rather talk about local content or training or subnational revenue payments and how governments split up their share of the money or almost anything other than what's going to really hit their bottom line. And it concerns me that, for example, in the African Mining Vision, I understand the value of downstream spin-offs and all the rest of it. But if securing good tax revenue, good fiscal revenue from the sale of non-renewable assets isn't somewhere near the center of a government's agenda, I think that they're missing out on the prize.
Thanks, Don. I'm looking at our colleagues from Brookings to do a quick time check. We are a bit at time for questions, but I'm wondering if we have time for maybe a couple more. Yeah? Maybe two more? Oh boy. Wow. Uh-oh. We're going to have to fight it out. Can we do a couple more? We're cutting into your coffee break, so just so folks know. I think I saw a hand, the gentleman towards the back. Yes, Daniel, yes, in front of you. and then to Daniel, and the lady in red, you three seem to put your hands up before everybody. Sorry, guys. Quick on the draw.
Good morning. My name is Michael Keating. I'm with the University of Massachusetts, and I'm also working on a project with the University of Cape Town on how to bring the African university sector into the governance discussion. So, well, my question is really something quite different, and that is on last year at the Ndaba, which is the major African mining conference, there was a tremendous amount of discussion on the informal sector and what to do about it. South Africa, with the collapse of the gold mining, formal gold mining sector, has seen the emergence of the Zama as the sort of main revenue producer in the gold mining sector, and there's an estimation that there's $1 billion of revenue that the government isn't even seeing. So it's passing into the hands of criminal gangs, essentially, that are running these outfits. So my question is basically for the group is how do you see the informal sector in Africa? Is it something that government should attempt to control through basically making it illegal, as they tried to do in South Africa? Or are there other mechanisms that should be put in place to at least extract some revenue from the sector that can be used for development? Thank you.
Thank you. I just asked try next to keep your questions brief because we're going to run out of time very quickly. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Leslie Cosgrove. I'm with Amaranth Village, a small nonprofit. My question is around transparency and perception. And I know that that's a global issue. But specifically, my question is more about Nigeria because I have more experience in Nigeria. All this transparency, and which is wonderful, the problem is perception of the population. And when it starts to get divided by the political issues, the religious issues, the North and South division, okay, how do we balance transparency? Because we all think that transparency is going to be the answer to a lot of these problems, but transparency, and we see that here in the United States, okay, transparency isn't the issue if the perception is off balance. How do we deal with that?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Daniel Muley with Oxfam, and I'm curious just about an emerging area of transparency that I think Isabel mentioned around costs that I think PWIP Indonesia is working toward at the moment. And I'm wondering if you could speak more to the rationale for prioritizing that, Mariatti. And Don, you had also mentioned about needing to be both more specific about the sorts of data we use and about the need for project economic data. So I'm wondering how that sort of information might have a real use and a real value when we do those sort of project-specific analyses. And just more generally, we've talked a lot about getting a good deal, but I'm wondering about when we look to secure the revenues after having that deal, how does data analysis really help us to ask the right questions about government's efforts to control costs or combat corporate tax avoidance? I think I heard transfer pricing mentioned a couple of times as well. How does data help to inform our work around that?
Great, thank you, Daniel. Again, I apologize, I'm going to ask my speakers to be as brief as you can. Hit the questions that you would like to hit. Barnaby?
On the transparency and division in Nigeria, there are problems. There are obvious problems. I don't think having quality information is one of those problems, or at least it's not causing a problem, rather. I think just as we see here or elsewhere, having really good fact-based conversations help. Whether people choose to pay attention to them is another matter. In somewhere like Nigeria, corruption is not a partisan issue, insofar as everyone thinks it's bad. It's how much they are willing to look the other way is another matter. So I think having quality information, having quality journalism and investigative journalism, which is something that is resource intensive and is always, there's never enough of it to go around, especially in a country with less capacity in their press. But I think more the better on that. I don't think there's a big downside to having the right facts.
Related to the perceptions, in my evidence, when I see before we asking the data and also community particularly, they already has perception that this is a big money. So that's the one case. And when they, how big this money, how big this oil is, they need the other thing, there is information and data. And also how significant, not just big, but how significant for us, how significant that the information that can we get, and also which information that can we access. So those kind of, and from perception to transparency, I think this is to rationalize the perceptions is through transparency. So transparency is just a means. So for example, when they have a conflict among central, subnational, community, corporation, and other, because they live with their own perception. Through transparency, they create dialogue. So for example, when I do a community scorecard, the citizens see the flare stack of the oil well, and when through the transparency of emergency contingency plan of of the corporation. This is quite technical, but they see, oh, they are a standard of the flare stack and also the radius from the homeland and other things. So they're trying to rationalize the perception. Oh, this is a high risk. This is a big investment, or this is another thing, and also this is also be risk on corruption and other. So I mean, this is trying to create a dialogue. The second question about the cost, the rationalize of why this is priority. I think this is also not just related to how to mitigate the risk, how to understanding the risk itself, because we see the cost. For example, if we see the cost because this is the deductible of the government take and also the revenue sharing, but we can see trying to attract the local economic, local content, multiplier effect economy for the community in terms of the cost, and also how company and also government in our Indonesian PST in procurement, on the procurement of goods and services, and also how the link one's procurement to other procurements, and also how government trying to administrative debts, and also the efficiency thing, why important we open the data of cost, and also how they spend on the labor, spend on the social, economic, and other things. I mean, this is also create dialogue as well. So, for example, how many money you spend for community development and CSR? How many money that you investment that you need to build emergency contingency plan, because this is very high risk for the people. For example, how you develop the gas emission instrument and other things. So this is kind of many kind improvement that we can do through this cost, not just projection the revenue, not just projection the benefit sharing, but also many other.
Thanks, Manti.
Okay, yes, actually I don't have any response to the questions that were asked, but I wanted to quickly react to what Don responded about the African mining vision. Actually, if you just read the African mining vision the way it is, probably, yes, you'd have a perception that it doesn't critically address issues of taxes, as I said, but then reading it side by side with the African mineral governance framework, I feel like it has some very important questions that will help you, or that will inform the policies or the policy review that you're going to do along the tax lines. So I wanted to say that if you mix the two, then it makes more sense. But if you just look at the vision, maybe it has some gaps.
Did you want to mention, Elvin, at all on, I think, this really important topic of illegality around mining? It is a topic that the Global Publishers You Pay Coalition is talking about. It's hot in most of the countries where we're working, and it's a really tough issue. And I think this is an important question. Did you want to comment on that?
Okay, about the informal mining?
Yeah.
Probably that is a small scale mining. Okay, yes. Yeah, it's quite a very disturbing issue as of now. But for us, the case of Malawi, it's artisan small scale mining. It's legal and it's covered in our legislation. But then sometimes the formality of it, it's a sector that is difficult to control, and the current practice has been shown that it is also being influenced by local, international, but it's also influenced by the neighbors. You find that most of the ASM sector in Malawi, it's being affected by the people from Burundi, from Zambia, from what. So there's a lot of mix-up. It's really a problem that we need to start addressing now. But the potential for this sector, it's quite good and it's quite strong. And it's somehow in Malawi, it's being considered as the way we consider the small-scale agriculture. It's a sector that has potential, but then it also has a lot of challenges, and it's easily manipulated by the external forces.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Elvin.
Two quick comments. First, on the artisanal mining question, my view is that it should be read through the lens of health and safety and women's rights and community rights, and not through the lens of revenue. And this is a place where I would draw quite a sharp distinction with industrial scale mining. If you try to tax it, you drive it underground, and you create huge vulnerabilities for communities, and particularly for women. I did some work in the artisanal gold mining sector in Kenya, and the stories were really quite shocking. And so I would say regulating the sector and prioritizing health and safety issues, human rights issues, women's rights issues is more important than the revenues that can be gained. And I do see those in direct conflict. If you try to tax, you drive it underground. On the question of costs, I would draw it out to a slightly broader context. Revenue payment data is, I think it's almost to say meaningless if you don't understand the production volumes, the price at which it was sold, and the cost to produce it. And certainly if you're interested in the main revenue generators, they're normally profit-sensitive taxes. And profit-sensitive taxes means after costs have been taken into account. And one of the biggest risks that governments face is that costs are overstated. All right? And it's not just, this comes down to a methodological question as well, because much of the data analysis that's being done is year by year by year, and we have 3 or 4 or 5 years of data to work with. But the problem is that inflated costs 10 years ago create loss carry-forwards that mean that Bulyanhulu didn't pay corporate tax for 16 years. So costs are a huge part of this, but I think that equally important is production volumes and realized sale price at the project level. And when I said that we can only analyze a few projects in really good detail based on public domain data, it's because in many cases those other data sets are really hard to find.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Don. With that, we are going to close this session. I've been instructed to provide you with a few lessons. Too many to count, I think we can agree. And I would highly encourage you to talk to our speakers during the break. But what I did want to mention is a couple of things that I think stood out from our panelists. One is this notion of realism and pragmatism. I think when you do the analysis and the work that everyone in this panel is doing, they have a realistic picture about the realities that we're dealing with, the political economy of the sector, the power dynamics. And I think, I think a couple of points I wanted to flag from the discussion is how long it takes and how much you need to invest in order for investigations to succeed. I think you talked about patience, Elvin, really fundamental, and really being pragmatic about what your expectation is that you can draw out of your deep analysis or even shallow analysis. So I wanted to flag that one. The other one I wanted to flag, which I thought was a really important one, is Elvin's point around being very careful about your recommendations that emerge from an analysis and being absolutely politically astute as to, especially when you're recommending or it's obvious that maybe a contract negotiation is the way to go, what are the politics around that and how that ultimately might make a situation worse. I think it's extremely astute that civil society is thinking about that and being careful. I think sometimes we're painted as being too extreme. And I think this panel, and I would argue most of my colleagues in the room, are actually quite careful and pragmatic in terms of the way they deliver information and their findings. I think also what came out of the panel very strongly is a critical importance of project level analysis. For sure the national level is important, but to really understand the impacts of the industry, revenue implications, we need to look at the project level. And looking at communities around that project is material for us to understand the potential economic impacts, potential environmental and social risk, and what the future might look like. So I think that disaggregation and that view to the very, very local level is fundamental. And I would really welcome that research request to look at that level. I think that's really welcome. I think also, one key point that Don made, I think is really fundamental, is the timing of revenue isn't analyzed. There's a lack of analysis on the timing of revenue and how fundamental that is to planning. And as we're looking at climate change policy, the potential volatility in renewable minerals and also in oil and gas coming up, the timing of revenues is under question. And this needs to be looked at very carefully. Also, I'd like to flag the very innovative ways that existing institutions and governance mechanisms are being leveraged. So I think Indonesia brings a lot of lessons in that. So working with the Anti-Corruption Commission, right? Working with state and local governments, I think that those innovations can really be drawn out and may be cool to your point. Maybe that's a research area that would be helpful. I'd also flag, we didn't get too much into it, but Oxfam Malawi and the Publish What You Pay Malawi partners using the EITI process to force this debate between the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Ministry of Finance was actually a really good way to go, and made the entire process of the EITI be helpful on this very sensitive political issue of the contract negotiations. Finally, I wanted to just mention this point that Don made around contracts standing alone, that contracts are key. Some extractives data needs to be worked a little bit more. Maybe contracts don't, and especially the annexes. One thing I've learned of working with Don and my colleagues is the annexes of contracts are extremely important, and maybe 1 or 2 lines in those annexes. So I just wanted to flag that. I know that there's many, many more things that I missed, but we don't have enough time to talk about that. But I would ask you to thank our panel.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.